So I recently saw a video titled "Why Are Americans Mad at China?" And this is by the creator named Ben Coleman, and he's been living in China. He left recently, but he had been living in China for a few years, making videos about kind of the differences between China and the UK, because that's where he's from, but also touching on the United States sometimes because those videos tend to do better if you put the United States in your title. I sometimes watch other content creators that talk about China because it gives me ideas, but it also gives me different perspectives and different ways of thinking about some of the issues that we deal with as foreigners living in China, especially when we go home. I was recently in the United States, and when we go home and we talk about things like our experiences here in China, and people truly don't understand, and so they often have preconceived ideas or thoughts about China. And all the people I talked to when I was home, none of them had ever been to China. So a lot of conversations that were very interesting because people would say, like, oh, I heard this about China, whatever negative thing that they heard in the news. And I'd be like, oh, that's really not like that at all. It's very normal here in China. And so he touched on a couple of things in his video, and he stayed away from politics because he said, I'm not going to talk about the politics behind it, just talking about his own personal experience. And he talked about how the media often portrays China in a very negative light, which I agree with, and many people have talked about it. But people don't really talk about why the media portrays China in such a negative light, and that is politics. So I wanted to give my opinion on this topic also, about why are Americans angry or hateful or distrustful of China, specifically certain Americans. I'd say Republicans tend to be more negative towards anything outside of the United States or anything that doesn't glorify the United States. And there's a lot of politics behind it. We first have to have a little bit of a history lesson. I'm not going to go way back, because if you go way back to like the 1800s where they had the anti-China or the China Exclusion Act, that's way back. But this hatred for China stems way, way, way back. But I'm only going to go back to about 1945 when the United States really took on the role of an empire. And this is the first kind of piece of information that we need in order to understand why Americans hate China. Many people within the United States and many people outside of the United States also believe that the United States is a country, and it isn't. It's an empire. And there's a big difference between countries and empires. And I think that's where this all starts. And we have to look at the United States as military empire. That's what it is. It's a militarized empire which has gone around the world and subjugated pretty much everyone in anything that has gone against it, from assassinations to coups to economic sanctions to every form of control or pressure it could put on its adversaries or what it perceived as adversaries. And that's kind of the basis of the anti-China media and the basis of anti-China rhetoric, and kind of the basis for what I think is leading up to some sort of confrontation in the next 10 to 20 years. I think we're at a tipping point where the United States could either step back and allow for other nations to self-govern and to determine their financial and their military futures, or the United States could push forward and say, no, we are going to be number one, and we will continue our path of subjugation. And so we have to really go back to the end of World War II, when no nation really could stand against the United States. All of Europe was destroyed, including Russia. All of Asia was destroyed, including China, Japan, Philippines, Korea. Pretty much every center of power that existed before the United States had been weakened from a military standpoint and from an economic standpoint. And so the United States took on the role of global security, as they like to call it. You can say global policing. They took on the role of rebuilding parts of the world, the parts that were beneficial for them. They helped rebuild Europe. They helped rebuild Japan and parts of Korea. They took over the roles in the Philippines and other colonies that were left by the previous empires. So the French Empire was essentially coming to an end. The British Empire was coming to an end, fully coming to an end. It had already started before that. But this new role was assumed by the United States. So the United States went about making sure that everybody abided by the rules that the United States was putting forward. And those were mostly economic rules on how trade was going to be conducted. This was establishing and promoting the U.S. currency as the reserve currency. And anybody that challenged that essentially was dealt with. And the United States continued to grow its empire. It had military bases in Europe, had it in Asia, and it just continued to expand its military bases around the world, cementing this global empire, the biggest empire we've ever seen, essentially, and the one that spans the entire globe. And so during the Cold War, the only power that was essentially resisting the United States was the Soviet Union. And the United States did everything it could to destroy the Soviet Union, and that's what happened, right? Through isolationist tactics, economic isolation, through sabotage, through any number of ways that you can disrupt or destroy a nation through propaganda. And this was the big Red Scare. So McCarthyism and a bunch of other things happened during this time in the early times. We had spies that were being regularly found and executed in the United States. And they created this propaganda of the only true government, the only real government, is a democracy. And that's just not the truth. Today it's not the truth. In the past it wasn't the truth. Most governments have been either a dictatorship or some kind of king or some type of oligarchy or some other form of a republic or a democracy that is not fully in line with the American democracy or the American republic. So if we look throughout history, countries have been operating to some degree of success. You know, some could be worse, some could be better. But throughout history and even today, there's plenty of nations that operate under a different form of government and are quite successful within the global community. And those can be dictatorships, those can be socialist countries, those can be communist countries, those can be democracies or some other form of government, like a king or something else where the monarch or the ruling elite have control of the government and the people don't decide. But the United States started to push this idea that the only true form of government is a democracy, and they point to other failed nations and say, look, their form of government didn't work. So they'll point to Cuba, they'll point to the Soviet Union, they'll point to Venezuela, and they'll point to many dictatorships in Africa and say these nations failed because of their government. But they don't tell you that they were actively working against these countries. So during the Cold War, communism and socialism was actually spreading through Africa, spreading through South America and Central America. Even in Europe, countries were adopting socialist ideas and socialist governments. The socialists were, to some extent, winning because socialism is about society. It's about the people. Now, because the United States actively said this is a model that we don't support and we don't agree with. We're going to actively work against it. They point to the Soviet Union, they point to all these other countries and say they failed without really going into the reasons why they failed. They just blame it on the government and not everything else that was happening at a macro level. So one of the reasons that we get so much anti-China hate, getting back to the original point of Ben's video and also the point of this video, is you have to understand that the history of the United States is an empire, specifically in the last 100 years, and that empire is actively suppressing any challengers. So the Soviet Union in socialism or communism was a challenger, and it did everything it could to destroy it. Now, China, which is no longer a socialist economy, so it is still a communist and socialist state, and the government is controlled by one party, but the economy is very capitalistic. But they don't want to say that because that goes against everything that the United States kind of stands for. They've been promoting this idea of democracy and capitalism, and they've been saying the capitalist model is the best model for economic progress. And so when China adopted that around 1980s is when it really started with Deng Xiaoping, but when they were let into the World Trade Organization, I think in 2001, that's when things really switched because they had to in order to abide by the rules of the World Trade Organization. And that's when the economy kind of really took off. So all of the anti-China rhetoric that you see coming from the United States is not really about communism or socialism. It's about having a competitor that is competing and winning. And that's what empires do. They try to stifle out competition. So all of the negative content that you see about China, most of it is half-truth or complete lies. But the media is putting that out because the American empire is suffering from an economic standpoint at this point in 2024. And this is why I'm saying in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be the big turbulence, I think, when it comes to China in the United States and kind of globally. Will the United States, like many empires before, be able to accept or to step back and allow for a new competitor to emerge? And that's kind of where we are right now. I don't think that the United States will be willing to step back based on previous actions. So that's where I think we'll see more and more anti-China content coming out in the next 5, 10, 20 years, especially if the United States sees China has a serious competitor, which it definitely sees it has a serious competitor now. But we could see maybe in 5 years they feel they've won, or they could feel like they're even losing more, and so therefore they'll get more desperate and more content will come out against China, saying China's this evil empire that is, all the things that they've already said, from human rights to competitive practices to, bullying neighbors to everything that the media is currently saying, right? So why do Americans hate China? Is because they don't actually understand their own country, that it's not a country, it's an empire. And they don't actually understand that empires are, by nature, designed to squash any competition. And so the media, which is in bed with the politicians, which is being fed the narrative, tells the people that China is this big bad country that's trying to take over the world, essentially, is what they're saying, that it's the enemy, that it is actively pursuing policies that are hurting the United States, which, if you're an empire, you would think that is true. Because you'd say, they're winning, and we don't like when they win, so therefore, what can we do for them to stop succeeding or stop winning? Now, China is a nation that is socialist by nature, by the sense of the government, but the markets are capitalistic. And that's why the United States is essentially losing. Because here in China, the government controls the businesses, while in the United States, the businesses control the government. And so the businesses are losing, and they're not liking that, which is why they're putting more and more pressure on the politicians in the media to demonize China, to try and create a conflict that doesn't need to happen, but probably will, because there's enough forces from the empire to try to disrupt what China's been doing for the last 70 years. Or however long you want to look at it. If you say the 1980s as kind of when it really started to become a competitor to the United States. Because if you look before that, the United States didn't really care about China as a country. This is the same as they don't care about smaller nations that aren't competing with them. There are plenty of dictatorships in Africa. There's plenty of socialist countries like Venezuela, like Cuba, where they don't really care about those nations. They aren't competing. So you don't hear a bunch of really negative content about those nations. It's not constantly in the news. It's not constantly the headlines, because those nations are of little significance or threat to the United States as an empire. China, big threat. Soviet Union at the time was a big threat. And so those were the ones that were demonized, and those were the ones that were, well, a lot of focus was on those. Communism as an idea was a big threat to democracy, at least perceived as a big threat to democracy. And so any country that was starting to turn red, the United States went in to disrupt. So that's why I think the Americans hate China, is because, one, like Ben was saying, the media that's given to them is all negative. Most of them have never come to China and experienced anything for themselves. And they don't understand why they're getting that media. So it's a lack of knowledge or understanding of what their own country is that creates this negative news cycle, and also creates these negative opinions that I personally don't think are needed. But again, when an empire feels threatened, it will take actions to neutralize that threat. And I think this is why the next 5 to 10 years will be the most turbulent time, because I think that will be the real deciding time for how this plays out between China and the United States. If there is a conflict, if the United States decides that the best way to deal with China is through military action, it probably will come in the next 5 to 10 years, while the United States still has the advantage. And, you can argue that all you want. But the United States military can project anywhere in the world within, 48 hours. Whereas the Chinese military would be hard-pressed to project their forces to the United States. Military invasions and military actions require a lot of staging, a lot of resupply, a lot of maintained supply chains, and I just don't think China has that ability currently to stage that kind of military effort in the United States, whereas the United States does have that capability, along with bases surrounding China, to sustain that type of military action against China. So the next 5 years is probably when we'll see the most likely see the most turbulent time, 5 to 10 years, in my opinion. But it's unfortunate because most Americans will just go along with it, being brainwashed and believing that China is somehow the one responsible for this aggression and the ones responsible for, all the failures in the United States, when it actually is an empire that has expanded for far too large and for far too long, and that it's no longer sustainable. And so it's kind of eating away at itself and doesn't know how to scale back to refocus on the country of the United States and actually make the country stronger and the people stronger, because it's focused too much on the empire. So it'll be interesting. I do think the United States in the people of the United States citizens hate China for reasons that they don't realize because of the media. But the media is controlled by the corporations and the politicians who shape the narrative. So the empire is against anything that threatens it. So this is interesting because Ben wanted to look at it more from just a media perspective, but I feel you have to go much deeper to look at it from what is actually happening behind the scenes, because the media is just the face of the policies and the decisions of the people who actually are in power. And the people in power in the United States are the capitalists, and they have, an empire built around the United States, and they have their companies and their businesses in every corner of the world, and they are the ones who are essentially responsible for American policy. So it's interesting. I hope that in the next 5 to 10 years nothing bad will happen, but I also feel this is going to be the most turbulent time for it's kind of all coming to a climax. But this video is coming to an end because I've been rambling for too long. Let me know what you guys think. You think it's a problem of empires that they all tend to fall after time because they become too stretched out and they become too bloated and they become too costly, and the United States is hitting that point and it's lashing out at anything that it perceives as an enemy or a threat? Or do you think I'm way off topic and it's just normal, it's just a normal way that countries interact, and China actually is doing a lot of bad things and the United States is just responding to those bad things? Leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. And also, thank you to our members. We have a couple of members now, so thank you for being a member. And if you guys want to be a member, I'm actually going to revamp the membership in a couple of days or weeks and try to make it more appealing so that we can get more members, because it's difficult sometimes to get ads because of the content that I talk about, and it's sometimes difficult to get sponsors based on the content that I talk about. So the best way to support the channel would be to like, subscribe, become a member, and I will see you in the next video.